Welcome to BACKtalk, the premier podcast from Successful Black Parenting Magazine, featuring in-depth conversations and expert insights on crucial topics for Black families. We are ranked number 1 on FeedSpot as the best Black family podcast, and we're in second spot as the best mom podcast, and we're now number 1 on Million Podcast as well. So we're over here winning. We're just winning, y'all. I'm your host, Janice Robinson-Celeste. And now, Successful Black Parenting Magazine has an interactive community of like-minded Black parents called the Black Parenting Academy, where you can converse and post questions, comments, wins, and concerns in a safe space. And I'll be sharing that link probably later throughout the show so you can find it, but you got to stay tuned and watch for it, okay? As parents, we all dream of sending our children to college to unlock opportunities. But what happens when that very system designed to support them is being dismantled? We're going to find out in just a minute.
This is BACKtalk by Successful Black Parenting Magazine, the most listened to podcast for parents by parents.
Hello, Successful Black parents. Thank you for tuning in to BACKtalk by Successful Black Parenting Magazine, your go-to podcast talk show for parents. We are live, and that means you can post questions in the comment section of our Facebook or YouTube pages, and I will address your questions live on air. Please don't forget to share if you care. Send our podcast to your friends, shout it out to your followers, and don't forget to use hashtag BACKtalk when you post. Today in the studio, I have a very special guest. Her name is Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. She is the best-selling author of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? You know that book. And she's back with a powerful new book called Peril and Promise. Today, we'll dive into what most parents know about DEI and what's going on out in the world with administration, the rollbacks, the affirmative action, and we're going to learn how to prepare our children to thrive on today's campuses. Welcome, Dr. Tatum.
Thank you so much for having me, and congratulations on all your success with this broadcast.
Thank you. We worked so hard. We just reached over 100 a couple of weeks ago, 100 broadcasts, so I'm really excited about that. Now, I gave you a brief introduction, but God knows you've done so much more, Dr. Tatum. Please introduce yourself to our audience and tell them all the wonderful things you do and all the Black excellence that just surrounds you.
Well, I will be happy to say a little bit about the fact that I served as president of Spelman College for 13 years, from 2002 to 2015. And I also have a long history with Mount Holyoke College. I was a faculty member there and dean of the college and acting president. And fast forward 20 years, I came back to serve as interim president in 2022, 2023. And it's that long history in higher education that inspired my most recent book, Peril and Promise, College Leadership in Turbulent Times. Happy to talk with you about it.
Well, we are indeed in turbulent times right now. But before we get into all of that, we always ask our guests an icebreaker because you have such a celebrated career. Can you share something about yourself that most people might not know?
That's an interesting question. I think maybe most people would not know that I grew up in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, which is a small town about 30 miles from Boston. My parents moved there in 1958 when I was just a 4-year-old. And my father became the first African-American professor to teach at Bridgewater State College, now known as Bridgewater State University. So I had this really interesting growing up experience. I could use that adjective, interesting, growing up, being born in Florida, born in Tallahassee, Florida, but moving to the Northeast as a young child, growing up in this small New England town where I was often the only Black child in my classes. And a lot of that experience, I think, informs the way I think about inclusion today.
Wow. That is very interesting that you had such a great role model too, with your dad and your parents. So, and that you were the only Black child. That actually is an experience that I hear about a lot today.
Yes.
And parents call me, usually because there's some issue involved with being the only Black child in the classroom. But we'll talk about that. For the parents who might not know, can you give them a brief update of what's going on in the world today with colleges and universities and DEI and affirmative action? Just kind of summarize it if you can.
Sure. Well, we know that the Supreme Court eliminated affirmative action, race-based affirmative action, with their Supreme Court decision back in 2024. That changed how colleges could think about their admissions. It didn't mean that they can't admit Black students, of course, but it meant that they weren't supposed to be looking at race as a deciding factor or as a contributing factor to who they decided to admit. Then fast forward to the election of President Trump and his executive orders, which he issued right after his inauguration in January 25, in which he declared the end of all so-called illegal DEI. That's what he called it, illegal DEI. Lawyers will tell you that DEI programs are not illegal. Many of them certainly are not. But really anything having to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, President Trump declared as illegal and advised colleges and universities to discontinue, not just colleges and universities, all organizations, to discontinue any DEI activities that they might have been engaged in. State legislatures across the nation, particularly in what we call red states, Republican-led states, have also passed legislation eliminating DEI programs or budget inclusion on their, universities for diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. But those DEI programs have not been eliminated everywhere. And there are lots of places that are committed to remaining inclusive and creating welcoming spaces. So one thing parents should know is that their students have choices and they can vote with their feet, in the sense that those schools that are committed to maintaining and continuing to foster those supportive programs still exist. And, those are the places you might want to be thinking about finding for your college-going student.
But they are losing federal money if they don't comply, correct?
Yes and no.
Okay.
And the reason I say yes and no is that there have been some very high-profile cases. Harvard being one, right? Harvard, Columbia, other places have been threatened with the loss of federal funding if they don't comply. And in fact, there are some lawsuits pending, right? Because the lawsuits say there's nothing illegal about what we're doing. And so to cut off our funding would be a problem. Now, most institutions, I'm going to say most institutions are flying below the radar, meaning, they're not raising their hands saying, we're still doing it, but they are still doing it, in the sense that they are looking at how they can, within the parameters that the federal government has provided, how can they still provide an environment that is welcoming for everyone.
Yes, indeed.
Now, I have some more to say about that.
Oh, please go for it. Yes, please. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's just what I was about to say is that when I write about this in my book, Peril and Promise, but when I was a dean at Mount Holyoke College, this is now, almost 30 years ago, but long before the DEI controversy, one of the things I said to my staff that we should be focused on was A, affirming identity of all of our students, B, building community so that everyone feels included, everyone feels welcome, everyone feels like they can thrive here, and C, cultivating the leadership of the next generation of students, recognizing that our students need to be able to engage with people different from themselves if they're going to be successful after college. And so how do we do that? For most people are still growing up in segregated communities, and they are coming from segregated schools. They're entering into colleges and universities that for many people are the most diverse places they've been up to that point. And so there's a lot of learning that can happen there if we are intentional about it. But this statement of what was important came to be known as the ABCs: affirming identity, building community, cultivating leadership. And I mention it here in this context because when I'm talking to college leaders today who are saying, we can't talk about DEI anymore, what should we be doing? I say, you might not be able to talk about DEI, but you can talk about the ABCs. And the ABCs, affirming identity, is not just about affirming the identity of some students, it's about affirming the identities of all of our students. There's nothing illegal or even controversial, one might argue, about saying we want to affirm the identities of all of our students. The anti-DEI movement is fueled in part, though not entirely, but fueled in part because some white people, when they hear DEI, feel like they're not including me, I'm left out, right?
Right.
But if you talk about affirming everyone, that you are talking about everyone. I use this analogy, which I think is useful for your listeners to think about. And that is, imagine a group photo. Imagine you and I and 100 other people are in a room together and somebody takes a group photo and we each get a copy of that photo. The first thing we are going to do is look at the picture and try to find ourselves in it. We're going to look for ourselves in that picture. But let's imagine someone has cropped it in such a way that the people on the edges are not in the picture, or they've digitally removed us so that we look. And even though I know I was standing right next to you, I see your face, but I don't see my own because someone took it out. If that were to happen, we would say, what's wrong with that picture? But if it happened over and over again, where we got the photo and we weren't included in it, even though we were standing in the room when it was taken, we wouldn't say, what's wrong with that picture? We would start to say, what's wrong with me? How come I'm never included? Why am I always being left out? And so my advice to educators is to think about who's missing from the picture. And if you get in the habit of asking that question, who's missing from the picture, you get more intentional about making sure that everyone can see themselves in that picture. And if we apply that to colleges and universities, when children and parents visit campuses, they need to be asking, do I see myself in this picture? And how do I see myself in this picture? And if the answer is, I don't see myself here, it's probably not going to be a good fit. But if there are college leaders and college staff and college faculty who have been intentional, despite the anti-DEI rhetoric, who have been intentional about trying to make sure everyone sees themselves well represented in the curriculum, in the classroom, in the social activities that are taking place, that's a place where you're likely to feel included. And inclusion is one of the most important, feeling included, feeling a sense of belonging is one of the most important characteristics of students who persist to graduation.
No, and that was a great analogy. We have questions on the screen that are for parents as well as by parents. So the first one is, parents with affirmative action going, do you believe colleges will become less diverse? And I'm going to ask that question and pose it to you, Dr. Tatum. What do you think?
I think the answer is some will become less diverse.
Mm-hmm.
And you might say, well, why just some? There are some institutions that are very, very selective. Out of the thousands of people who apply, fewer than 10% are accepted. And if those institutions are not able to think about race as a factor, or they get very nervous about being sued or, getting in trouble with the Trump administration, I believe you may see a decline in the diversity on those places. But I want to tell something which I talk about in my book and many people don't understand, and that is there are many colleges that admit almost all of their applicants. And the reason they do is because they need the students. There are today more college spaces available than there are students to fill them. And so if you are, and that's because the birth rate's been declining, right? In the US, the birth rate's been declining. And so there are lots of colleges, maybe not the most famous ones, but there are lots of good colleges where you can get a great education that are very eager to enroll students of all backgrounds. And because they're not particularly selective, you don't have to have, quote, affirmative action. to strengthen your application. If you are a successful student, there are lots of colleges that want successful students of all backgrounds.
We're going to need a list of those colleges for our audience so that they can send their children to those schools, because, you know, I'm worried about how will this impact admissions, you know, with them cutting DEI and affirmative action. What
And
should
that's,
we expect?
well, so of course, we know one impact is that for climate reasons, because students want to feel, they want to be in a place where they feel like they're appreciated, where they are, people are going to love on them, where they're going to be mentored, where they're going to have opportunities. And that is driving up application rates at HBCUs, of
Yeah.
course. You know, places like Spelman and Morehouse and Howard and Hampton and, you know, North Carolina A&T and all the schools that you might think of are seeing record application numbers, because there are a lot of Black students who are saying, I want my child to, and children who are saying, students who are saying, I don't want to have to, you know, put up with anti-DEI nonsense. I want to be a place where I am appreciated for all of me. And you can find that certainly at an HBCU. So, and a lot of students are voting that way. But I do want to say that there are a lot of colleges and universities, PWIs, that are eager to enroll students of all kinds, including Black and Brown students. And if a parent is sitting at home with a US News and World Report magazine rating colleges, you know, if you've read the rankings or if you go online and read their rankings, there is data that will tell you what you need to look for is what is the acceptance rate.
Mm-hmm.
If the acceptance rate is 1%, that's a place, that's a Harvard, right? Harvard, Stanford, places like that have very low acceptance rates. A school like Spelman has an acceptance rate. A lot of people apply to Spelman, and maybe the acceptance rate is 25 or 30%. 1 out of 3 applicants is going to be admitted. But there are lots of schools that have acceptance rates of 65, 70, 75%, and where almost everyone is admitted. And those are, and just because they're admitting many people doesn't mean they're not great schools. So if you are wondering, you know, if you're saying to yourself, my student is an average student, you know, gets B's and C's and, you know, average SAT scores, that student's not getting into Harvard. We know that. But there are lots of schools where that student can go and have a great college experience.
Okay, so the parent question is, do you think your child's college experience would be better at a HBCU or a predominantly white institution, which is PWI? Drop your thoughts below. You don't have to answer this one, Dr. Tatum, but we do have a question from the audience that I hear a lot from white people. Never hear this from Black people, because we know the real deal. For some reason, they do not, and I don't understand why. And I think that's root. The question is rooted. I'll put the question up in 1 second. I think the question is rooted in the fact that a lot of times white people don't expect Black people or people of color to have the same intelligence level, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
some of us surpass, a lot of us surpass some of the white students, but we don't
Yes.
get in because of gatekeepers. But I'm going to let you talk more about that, because here's the question. Wouldn't you rather your child be accepted into a university or hired for a job because they truly belonged and earned it on their own merit rather than because of the color of their skin? Let's address that, because obviously
Yes.
she
I'm
doesn't
going
know
to.
our history.
Yes. Yes. So this question, here's what I want to say. Nobody is being admitted because of their skin color. I just want to say that. Even if an institution has an affirmative action program in place, which they don't now because it's been outlawed by the Supreme Court. But before the Supreme Court, a Black student who went to Harvard or a very selective institution was not being admitted because of their skin color. They had to have great grades. They had to have great SAT scores or other demonstration of excellence, right? Not everybody's excellence is demonstrated by their SAT scores, but they've had great letters. Maybe they've had leadership positions. Maybe they played in a state orchestra. You know, maybe they've been excelled in some other way. All of those things would need to be true in order to be admitted to an institution that had a very low acceptance rate. Being able to say that you're going to help diversify the campus because of your background was a plus, but it wasn't the reason. So I think the question is poorly framed. But I also think it's important for all of us to understand that the people most likely to get in to any of those highly selective institutions are white, wealthy students who are connected to the institution in some way. In fact, there's a very interesting study that I talk about in my book, Peril and Promise, that describes an investigation of who was most likely to be admitted to Harvard. And the people who were most likely to be admitted to Harvard were athletes, legacies, meaning they had a family member who previously went to Harvard. They were a child of a donor, meaning somebody wealthy gave money to the institution, or they were a child of a faculty or staff member, somebody worked at the institution. The four categories are referred to by an acronym, ALDC: athlete, legacy, donor, child of a faculty member. Those four categories lead to an overwhelmingly white and wealthy applicant pool. And you might say, what about athletes? What about all those, Black basketball and football players? Actually, the athletic category favors people who come from wealthy families because they tend to be people who have had a lot of talent development, meaning they've been going to sports camps all their lives, meaning they've been playing in private clubs, and have had access to development in ways that often kids from low-income Black families have not had. So even the athletic category favors white, wealthy applicants. And the researchers who did this study said, if you combined all of those preferences, the preference for athletes, the preference for legacies, the preference for donors' children, and the preference for children whose parents work at the institution, all of those groups combined take up more spots than Black and brown students combined in the pre-affirmative action, pre-Supreme Court days. So even when the affirmative action programs were in place, admissions still favored white and wealthy applicants. Now that those now that the affirmative action programs are eliminated, it is still possible for students of color to be admitted. And in fact, after the Supreme Court decision, there was research looking at what happened, who got in. Did the admission of Black students fall off the map? Did Latino students fall off the map? What they found was there was some slight change. Slightly fewer Black students got into Harvard than the year before, but still a significant number did. And I think we can say they earned it on their own merit. It was not because of their skin color.
So the acronym ALDC, right?
Yes.
Curious question. What were their SATs and grades like to get into Harvard?
What the data showed, I can't tell you what their grades and SAT scores were specifically, but I can tell you that the data showed that the ALDCs, when matched up to other groups, were not as well qualified.
Amazing. See, this is information that never really gets out there and needs to be out there for people to know, because people make that assumption that it's the color of your skin and you don't have the intelligence to be there. And that's just, it's not right. For one thing, it's not correct. And we have struggled just to get past gatekeepers. And that's one of the successes of affirmative action. We didn't have to worry about gatekeepers keeping us out for the reason of our color. So I appreciate that answer, and I appreciate the question. Thank you, Polished Mom, because it needs to be talked about. How do rollbacks in these programs affect everyday experiences of Black students on campus? Are they seeing something different now going on?
I think the most dramatic place where you could find changes are in those places where they have eliminated the DEI offices, right? So particularly in states, I want to use like Texas or Florida, where the state government is really anti-DEI and has said, there will be no programs in any of these state institutions or even in the private ones. You have to get rid of all that stuff. What you find is that, let's say there was the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion that provided specific programs to support first-gen low-income students who might have felt out of place at the institution. There were programs specifically designed to welcome people or to provide support, or just, maybe there was an African-American cultural center where students could go and hang out in their free time, knowing that they would feel at home. A lot of those programs, those places have been removed. The staff have been let go. So sometimes the offices were renamed, let's say the Office of Community and Belonging, instead of the DEI office, or Multicultural Affairs. Now it's got this new name, or Office of Student Success. But if the staff who were supporting you are no longer employed, do you still feel welcome? Do you still feel at home? That kind of change is probably the most obvious.
Right. And I want to just make a point here, because DEI and affirmative action did not just affect minority, Black, and brown students. It was also, people with different disabilities,
Absolutely.
women, right?
Absolutely.
Women.
Absolutely.
So can you just talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, there's an example in my book about, for example, support for students who identify with LGBTQ concerns, right? And so I'm going to use that as an example because this example comes from Texas. So they eliminated any specific references to LGBTQ support on the campus. And there was an office that had been doing workshops, not just to support students who identified as part of that community, but also doing workshops for allies, how to be a better ally to someone who was LGBTQ. And as a consequence of the changes in the law, they had to eliminate that ally program. They had to eliminate all programming that had anything to do with LGBTQ, including the ally program. And what I thought was so ironic about that was that this was a campus that was experiencing a lot of anti-gay violence, right? Harassment. And so if you are trying to address harassment, you would want to have a program for allies to help people understand how they can help stand up against that kind of harassment. If you eliminate those programs, then you are making that population that much more vulnerable on your campus. And that's an example of the ways in which, as you said, it's not just Black and brown students, and even it's not just marginalized students, whether they're marginalized by disability or their race or ethnicity or their sexual orientation. When we talk about cultivating the leadership of the next generation, we are talking about all students who need to learn how to engage effectively with people different from themselves. And if we can't even talk about people different from ourselves, we're not even supposed to mention certain words, how can we develop that leadership capacity?
Absolutely. And this is your book.
Yes, thank
let's
you.
talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to go back into talking about the students more. But the cover, tell us about the cover and how you came up with the title.
Sure. Well, Peril and Promise, College Leadership in Turbulent Times, really captures, I think, what the book is about. I spent many years as a college president, and people would say to me, surely that has to be the hardest job in America, to be president of a college during this rocky time. And that was even before the current administration took office. Certainly it's a rocky time now, very turbulent, and that's the peril. In the book, I describe some of the challenges facing colleges and universities today, whether that's the cost, whether that's the enrollment challenges, whether that's campus safety. We know we're living in a time when campus safety is on everybody's minds, whether it has to do with AI and how AI might be disrupting the educational process. These are all things that we might describe as peril. But I also want to talk about the promise. Like, what are the opportunities? In every crisis, there's an opportunity. What are the opportunities for higher education to really meet the current moment? And what leadership is required in order for that to happen? I think of it as kind of an insider's guide to higher education because I am an insider, right? I have been in higher education my whole life, it seems. But the transformation that young people experience when they are in a place that really helps them develop, helps them be their best, is undeniable. And and that's the promise of higher education.
Okay. Let's talk about a little bit more about the students, because when these things happen, we tend to have some mental health issues or crisis on
Yes.
campus. Like, what warning signs should parents look for, and how can they support their adult children from home?
Well, one of the things that we know is that this particular generation, students right now, are reporting more depression, more anxiety, more mental health concerns than previous groups of college students have. And one thing that they have in common may be high levels of social media use. And so, one of the things that researchers tell us is that the more you use your phone, the more time you spend scrolling on social media, the unhappier you are going to be. There's a section in the book on mental health on college campuses titled Put the Phone Down, that any activity that engages you with other people face to face, going for a walk, having lunch together, you know, walking to the library and studying together, those face to face interactions are going to make you feel better than if you are talking to somebody on your phone about those same things.
Yeah.
Just as human beings, face to face contact is important and helpful most of the time. So, one of the things that colleges are doing to try to improve student mental health is to structure opportunities for that kind of connecting. There's something called Project Connect, which is intended to get students in small groups together to do things like have lunch, go bowling, do the things that maybe many of us did when we were much younger and we didn't have cell phones then. But in today's world, a lot of young people are living their lives online, and it is damaging to their mental health. So one thing that parents should be paying attention to is just how connected to human beings is that young person. And if they're spending a lot of time alone on the phone, on the laptop, on the screen, how can you encourage your child to get involved, whether it's through volunteer work or something, where they're engaging with other people in person?
Yes. In-person connectivity. We need that as human beings. And we
Yes.
are getting further and further away from that. So I agree. I agree. And parents need to check in on their children, even if they're far away at another different university or college on the other side of the country. Like, how do we stay on top of this with our adult children?
Asking questions is a good way to just say, what did you do today? How'd you spend your time? Did you, how, who did you have lunch with? Just casual questions about social activity. What you don't want is your child sitting in a dorm room alone on a screen day in and day out. So just inquiring about activity, not in an intrusive way. I know as a parent and also as a college administrator that sometimes parents are too intrusive. They are hovering, they're calling, the helicopter, the so-called helicopter parent that's, just hovering over the child all the time. You do want to allow your student to have some autonomy, some independence, But I also know that many parents, including, and sometimes it's the kids who will initiate the contact, who want to talk to the parent every day or frequently. And so for the parent to just ask questions about, what did you do today? Who did you see? You mentioned, your friend down the hall. Why don't you and she go for coffee or something? Get out. It's a beautiful day. Get some exercise. Many campuses have wellness programs in their, gym, Zumba classes, all kinds of things that you can do that will be fun. Physical activity, we know, improves mood, improves spirit. But if you are concerned about a lonely child in a home, in a room, dorm room, all by themselves without enough connection, it might be an opportunity to pay a visit if it's close enough, or maybe even to reach out to a dean. Most colleges have like a freshman dean, first year dean, to say, I think my child is isolated, sounds depressed. Could somebody look in on her? There are resident advisors who will do that. And maybe someone will say, she'd be a great candidate for Project Connect. And so that kind of intervention could be helpful.
Okay. Well, we're going to have parents soon going out visiting colleges. What's the number one question you think parents should ask when they go to these college campus visits?
Well, of course, the student will have questions, right? About what that student wants to study, what the life is like, and sometimes parents get really excited about an institution that the student has no interest in. But let's say, you're there, you're wanting to know something. It might seem odd to ask this question, but when you enroll your student, you're expecting that student to graduate. I would ask, what's the graduation rate here? There are some schools that have abysmal graduation rates, where fewer than 4 in 5 students will, maybe the graduation rate is only 20%. If that's the case, maybe your child is the 1 in 5 who's going to graduate, but there are other schools where the graduation rate is 65%, 80%, 90%. So I would ask about that. And then if the student is interested in a particular field of study, for example, when my youngest son was looking for college, he was interested in studying science. He was particularly interested in physics. We visited a campus and I asked, how many Black physics majors do you have? It was a PWI. The answer was hardly any. Mm-hmm. And so why was that? Was it because it was an unwelcoming academic environment? They just didn't have any who were interested. There were no Black physics professors that would draw students in. But asking that question, if you are really interested in something and your student is an African-American student or a student of color, you might ask, how many other students of color do you have in the program? If there aren't very many, then the question might be, well, why is that? Are students being pushed out, or they just don't feel comfortable in this environment? And that, I used to, when I was president of Spelman, I used to say that to parents, if your daughter wants to major in science, a science field, ask how many Black women they have at that institution in that field of study. If you come here to Spelman, I can tell you, not only are there Black females majoring in physics, but we have Black female professors in physics. Your daughter's going to see herself in that picture. But that's the question. What's the picture you're interested in, and do you see yourself in it?
That is a great question. Now we're running low on time, but I want to get these questions in because these are so important. I could just talk to you all day, of course. But we have a question again from a parent, and also parents worry now about protest and safety. So we need to touch on that really quickly.
Yes.
How can we talk to our kids about balancing activism, free speech, and personal safety? Because now we even have lone gunmen coming on campuses and stuff like that. So I know that has to be in the back of parents' minds when they're going to a college or university with their student, especially if it's far away from home.
Sure. Well, campus safety, speaking as a former college president, It's at the top of your mind all the time. That's your number one responsibility. How do you keep your students, your faculty, your staff? How do you keep the community safe? And we know in this age of so much access to guns that it is difficult to do. Most college campuses are pretty open, meaning you can just walk onto them, right? They're not gated communities mostly. And even if they are, for example, Spelman is a gated campus, but they're not checking for guns at the gate, right? If you have a reason to be there, you're allowed on. Nobody's asking you to walk through a metal detector. And so the fact of the matter is, it's very difficult to prevent some of the things that we hear about. And that in itself is frightening to parents. It's certainly frightening to the college administrators in charge. What you can do, though, is help everyone to stay safe through, if you see something, say something, have rapid response communication. So if the campus needs to be locked down, everybody can be notified on their mobile phone instantly. You can have buildings that are open only with a swipe card and limit access. And there are things, common sense things that we campus leaders can do. But relative to campus protests, I think it's important to say that protesting is part of the college experience. And I say it not jokingly, but seriously. If you go back and look at the history of student protests from the very beginning of higher education, there have been student protests about one thing or another. Now, we know that when students feel strongly about something, they want to be able to express their point of view. And it is part of the developmental experience to do that. But most colleges have guidelines about time and place and appropriateness of, yes, there's free speech, but you can't disrupt people's classrooms. Yes, there's free speech, but you can't harass people walking to and from class. Yes, there's free speech, but you can't do it in a way that interferes with other people's rights, right? And so if the institution has provided guidelines, students can express their points of view without getting into trouble, right? And hopefully not experiencing violence. And if we look at the history, even during the height of the Israel-Hamas war and the protests that were happening on college campuses then, while there were some highly visible places like Columbia, for example, where the police were called in, or UCLA, where protesters were being attacked by off-campus community members, and there were injuries. Most places, the protests were peaceful. Most places, the protests were well managed by the campus. And most places, students were not at risk. So I think it's important to encourage your student to use good judgment. If you see that people are destroying property, you don't want to be a part of that. If you see that people are harassing others, you don't want to be a part of that. If you see that people are behaving in ways that you know to be inappropriate, you don't want to be a part of that. But you are certainly able and should feel comfortable speaking up if you feel passionately about something, because that is part of becoming an adult and learning how to use your power in the world.
No, absolutely. And parents, would you encourage your child to join campus protests or tell them to stay out of it for safety reasons? Be honest, comment below. Let me go to this last question. This is a question from or one of the same parents. Let's see, hold on, put it on the screen. Do you believe DEI efforts in schools and workplaces genuinely help Black families? Or do they sometimes reinforce a victim mentality? Can you comment on that?
Yes, I am happy to comment on it. I don't think so. Here's what I want to say about the phrase victim mentality. I spent a lot of my career writing about racism. Racism is a real phenomenon. We know that there are policies and practices that differentially privilege white people and differentially impact people of color. We can talk about redlining, for example. We can talk about lending practices. We can talk about, segregated schools and how they've been funded. Even today, how HBCUs, I'll use North Carolina as an example. North Carolina A&T is a large HBCU in North Carolina. There are universities in North Carolina that are receiving $16,000 per student. NCAT, North Carolina A&T, was only funded at the rate of $8,000 per student. That's a big disparity. And does race have something to do with it? I do believe it does. Does acknowledging those realities mean you have a victim mentality? I don't think so. I think it means you're analyzing what you see before you and commenting on it. So do DEI efforts in schools and workplaces generally help Black families? I think when well executed, I'm sure we could find examples of those that were not well executed, but a well-planned DEI program not only helps Black families, it helps all of the students have a better understanding of the world, how it operates, what needs changing, and how we can work together to change it.
No, great question. I'm glad you addressed that, because you hear these comments a lot when you're dealing with race and racial issues. So I appreciate your answer as well. Now we are out of time. I want you to tell people how they can get your book and where they can find your information.
Sure. You can find me at beverlydanieltatum.com. Peril and Promise is available at any bookstore near you. Or if you'd like to order it online, you can go to bookshop.org and support your local independent bookstore.
Fantastic. Dr. Tatum, I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. Like I said, I could speak with you all day long, and I appreciate you and everything that you said. You have to come back on the show sometime, because I did not even get to ask you all of the questions I had, because we had such a great conversation. So thank you so much.
Well, I'd be happy to come back anytime, and thank you for having me.
All right. I want to tell everyone thank you as well, and give a big shout out to all of you guys who have watched this and are watching the replay later on. Thank you so much for supporting us in this episode of BACKtalk by Successful Black Parenting. Be sure you follow us on social media too. We need you there. Click on everything, follows, likes, ads, because that helps us to thrive so that we can keep bringing you great content. And until next time, I wish you all the best and much success. So take care, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to BACKtalk by Successful Black Parenting Magazine. We'll see you soon.